One of the best times to create bedding areas on your properties are in the wintertime. You have all that energy that's down in the root system, and whether you're harvesting timber, creating hinge cuts, manipulating the habitat in whatever way you're doing with a chainsaw, handsaw, whatever you're doing, it's a great time to cut timber and then allow that energy to explode in the form of regeneration and to add both browse and cover on the ground for whitetails. Now, it's April 19th, not winter, not the dead of winter. We've had yet another major snowstorm that passed through the area. And so while I'd really like to start focusing on switchgrass and food plots and putting trail cameras out, getting some of the mock scrapes started, we're still talking a lot about bedding areas because until those buds break out, there's still some opportunity left to make some cuttings. But not all cutting, not all types of cuttings that you can apply on your land to get the chainsaw out for is going to be appropriate for your land. For example, I've worked on about 700 properties in 25 states for whitetails. And looking at those properties, I could say that 25, 30, 35% of those properties, it may have been appropriate to hinge cut on, and the rest, it was not. This is an example right here of a recent timber harvest on this property. You see with the mature hardwood that's been taken out, the woods behind us and up on the ridge are going to change drastically. Now, this was just a percentage of timber that was taken out. This was a select cut. And on this timber, in removing this, the bedding area is going to change, and the ability for this land to hold deer is going to change significantly. 1,000 pounds of forage per acre per year once this timber's out of that woods, and we're getting almost a clear cut status where you're getting 60, 70, 80% of the canopy removed. You're getting almost full sunlight to get on the ground, and you're getting that regeneration. The type of bedding areas that you can make on your land. Of course, everyone sees the quote buck beds in the buck bed videos out there where you're hinge cutting, you're creating a canopy, these deer are going to slip under there. And folks, I'm here to tell you, some areas deer tolerate a canopy, but they do not prefer a canopy. We can show some pictures of deer under canopies in the shade, in the cool area, and some trampolines where deer have crawled under these trampoline settings in someone's backyard. Sure, they love the shade and they love that cooler temperature in July, in August, maybe June, maybe even September. But they don't need that canopy to bed under, or there'd be a lot of unbedded deer across the entire country. So when you're making those tight bedding areas and those buck beds and the buck bed videos that are out there, when you're making those tight bedding constrictions on land, in some locations deer will tolerate that. And I'll give you an example. Northern Ohio, where you can go to areas where you can't see a tree in 2 miles in any direction because you just don't have big wood lots. It's flat. There's a great opportunity for high quality ag, and who can blame anybody for leveling the fields and planting agricultural settings of corn, beans, alfalfa, rotations, whatever it might be. Great opportunity to do so, and people have done that over the decades, and that's a great thing. But for that, there's not a lot of cover, and you're expecting to jam sometimes 30 deer into a 20-acre parcel, 50 deer into 100 acres of cover when there's no other cover around. In those cases, when you have high deer numbers and a low amount of cover, then deer are used to being tightly confined, and they can actually tolerate being almost on top of each other. Completely different when we flip up to the UP of Michigan, northern Minnesota, maybe even central deep woods of Kentucky, northern hardwoods of Pennsylvania, where there might be fewer deer and there's a whole lot of space. Space meaning there's an incredible amount of depth of cover. Deer can travel for miles at a time, not hit another road, and there's not a lot of deer, so they really have a lot of space. They're used to a lot of space. You take that tight, confining bedding area that you see online, a quote buck bed, and you install that in the upper peninsula of Michigan, northern Minnesota, and some of these big wood settings, and the deer will completely avoid it. I've seen 5-acre clear cuts that people have made for deer, and when those clear cuts are too confining and deer have to crawl, jump, wiggle their way through it, that might work for northern Ohio, that might work for southern Michigan, northern Indiana, southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, areas where there's not a lot of trees, fairly flat, a lot of ag, a lot of deer. Again, deer are used to not having their own space. But as that balance shifts to big woods, big cover, big habitat, and not very many deer, you need to think about matching those bedding areas to your land specifically. You have a big hardwood setting up in the northern wilderness area where there's not a lot of deer. You can get away with creating some great bedding areas just by harvesting the timber, maybe taking down a mature maple every 30, 40 yards, dropping it in your woods, putting that lumber down in the ground for side cover, removing 30% of the canopy, maybe 40%, getting sunlight to the ground so you're increasing regeneration for food, and then you're putting logs and tops on the ground so that you have that structure of bedding as well. Add some conifers to a mix like that. You can even diversify it and you forever have screening cover and side cover within that wood lot. You can do that to any area. So while I don't suggest the canopies too much because they can waste your time, take a lot of time, I do suggest you can really confine deer. They might tolerate with only seeing 5-10 yards in front of their nose in those high cover or low cover, high deer number areas. But when you get up to open areas, big woods, and the deer have space, you don't have a lot of deer, think big. Give yourself the ATV test. In an average ag setting like we are right here, where we have 50% cover, 50% woods, we have a lot of steep bluffs around here, but all the valleys and the tops are planted, then you could basically drive an ATV through your cuttings. If you can weave it in and out, if you can back up, turn through your cutting, that's about the right size, meaning that no dead ends in those cuttings. You don't want dead ends, meaning that a deer goes down through some cuttings, they have to stop, turn around. It's really bad when you get into northern settings where you have a high predation rate. And so whether you have cougars, wolves, or coyotes, bobcats, even wild dogs down in, say, northern Kentucky, southern Ohio, northern Indiana, southern Indiana, some of those areas where you get into some remote areas, deer do not want to be forced into a dead end, and they'll completely avoid those areas. So mid-range areas where 50% ag, 50% woods, 50% cover, if you do that, if you can pass the ATV test, that's a great general guideline. When you get into some of those small cover, big deer herd number areas, it can simply be a passageway 2 or 3 feet wide that you can slither into. Again, no dead ends. Deer don't want to go down 30 yards with timber all around them and they can't get out. That's one of the big no-nos I see on even timber cuttings, where you leave too many logs and tops and debris around where deer just can't simply move through. If it's tough for us, it's going to be very difficult for deer. And when you get up into the big wooded areas, whether that might be central Kentucky, might be a big wooded area in southern Indiana, southern Illinois. When you get into some of those areas, or northern Minnesota, northern UP of Michigan, where you get into some of those areas where deer are used to a whole lot of space, be very cautious about putting a lot of lumber on the ground. A little bit of cutting can go a long ways in those areas, especially when you're adjacent to some of the big open federal or state lands, or even commercial forestry properties where they're allowing timber to mature. So a little cutting can go a long ways. If you complete too much cutting, it can really hurt you. So I want you to think about not the perfect deer bed that you find online somewhere, or a picture you find. Think about matching the size and balance of your cutting to the amount of cover you have in the area and the amount of deer. If you have a lot of predators, think about that too. Deer don't want to walk by a pile of lumber like this, or a lot of brush on the ground, especially out in the woods in the dead of some remote section where there are a lot of predators, wolves especially up in northern areas, even central Wisconsin here. Think about the number of predators you have in the area, think about your size of woods, think about the number of deer, and match your bedding area appropriately by size. There's no one cookie cutter shape, size, or practice that fits on every property. The only concept that really applies is you have to have a concept of balance and size to actually match your property, to make sure you're applying the right fit for a bedding area for your location. Try it. I don't think you'll be disappointed. And really, it might be nothing more than actually seeing where the deer are bedding, try to match those conditions, and I think you'll be on the right track, and you'll be happy you did so going into this hunting season.